Hello, my name is Larry Smith. I'm the interim pastor of First Christian Church, Fort Thomas, Kentucky. This is a brand new edition of our community Bible study. Traditionally, we meet in the church and discuss the Bible in person. With the COVID-19 cases increasing in our area, it is unwise to continue that practice. But we want to provide a safe and ecumenical place to study the Bible. We welcome all to this study of the Gospel of Mark, the second and shortest of the canonical Gospels. Let me take a moment here at the start to explain the format of our course. It begins with a pamphlet I have written that can be sent to you via email if you do not already have a copy. You may read and study that as you will. Second, I will divide the material into sections and talk about them on YouTube, as I'm doing in this talk today. I will upload these videos on Wednesdays and send you the URLs so that you can view them when you have the time. Last, I will host a Zoom conference, which I will schedule for 7 p.m. on Tuesdays, to answer questions and encourage conversation over the materials for that evening. Let us begin. We are studying the Gospel of Mark. Well, we need to ask right away, what is a gospel? The meaning of the term gospel is good news, but that's a pretty ambitious topic and pretty vague. Good news means different things to different people. As we look at the writing itself, we can see that the good news has preaching in it, but it's not all preaching. It has miracles in it, but it's not simply a record of miracles. The good news has biography in it, but not in any modern sense of the word, and even in the ancient sense of the word, it lacks quite a bit. Mark has history in it, but it's not strictly a history. It has theology, but it's not like any of the theology books I've read. It is, in essence, a mixture of all these things. History, miracles, theology. It's a mixture of all these things. Mark calls it the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. So it's all these things in connection to and relationship to Jesus Christ. The good news here doesn't mean winning the lotto. It doesn't mean, that you won the Kentucky Derby. It doesn't mean a lot of things. What it means is the good news that surrounds, that comes from, is associated with Jesus Christ. Now, there are lots of Gospels written by early church members. Different scholars enumerate different numbers as to how many there were, but almost all agree it was over 20, 4 of which are in the New Testament, 4 of which have been chosen to be exemplars of what it means to be a Christian, how to live the Christian life, and so on and so forth. These 4 are in order in the canon: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first 3 of these are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic, S-Y-N, means together. Like a symphony makes sound, phonics, together. Syn, optic. You go to an optician to get your glasses. They work with eyesight and eyes and seeing. So synoptic means seeing together, or perhaps more loosely, a common vision. In this case, they have a common vision of who Jesus was and who Jesus is, as opposed to the Gospel of John. Just to give you one example, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus has a ministry of about 1 year, we think. If we read the Gospel of John, it looks like the ministry of Jesus is about 3 years. So that's just one of the differences that set apart Matthew, Mark, and Luke as Synoptic Gospels from the Gospel of John. Now, seeing that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, are so similar, how do we explain that? What is the reason why they have a common picture of Jesus? Now, over the years, various explanations have been presented. The one that scholars for the last 100 or more years have leaned toward is that Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke had copies of Mark before them as they wrote. Luke himself tells us in the prologue to the Gospel of Luke that he consulted many sources. He doesn't identify those sources, unfortunately, for us. It'd be nice if he did, but we speculate that one of those sources may well have been the Gospel of Mark. So Mark takes on more importance, I think, if we look at it in terms of Mark being a source for both Matthew and Luke. Now, in the pamphlet that I've written, when we get to the portion where we're discussing the scripture itself, the Gospel of Mark itself, you'll find oftentimes in the right-hand column a scriptural reference. On the left-hand side will be the scriptural reference out of the Gospel of Mark. On the right-hand side, you'll see references to Matthew's Gospel and to Luke's Gospel, and a couple times to John's Gospel. You'll probably be able to identify the abbreviations there for Matthew, Luke, and John. There's another one in there that you might not be familiar with, and that is an occasional reference to the Gospel of Thomas. Gospel of Thomas is a very distinctive book. It arises, some say parts of it in the 1st century, others say the 2nd century, so we have different ideas about when it was created. But the important thing here is that some of the passages in the Gospel of Thomas are almost exactly the same as passages out of the Synoptic Gospels. And I've included those references to the Gospel of Thomas in that right-hand column when there are those parallel passages, those passages which are alike. On the other hand, the Gospel of Thomas has some really strange things in it. I haven't included those, but those strange things are probably why the Gospel of Thomas is not included in the New Testament. Well, let's return our attention to Mark. Who is this character named Mark? What do we know about him? Well, we know from the text itself that Mark knew Greek. Assuming that he wrote it and didn't use a scribe or secretary to write it for him, he knew Greek. His Greek is not very sophisticated. It's not very learned. And in fact, Matthew and Luke will sometimes substitute more accurate words, especially verbs, but they will make small editorial changes as they appear to copy Mark's Greek. There's an interesting story in the Gospel which may or may not tell us something about Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, and only in the Gospel of Mark, we have a very interesting story. We don't know why it's included. Maybe it's a little bit of comic relief. But as the dramatic scene of the arrest of Jesus comes into play, there is a story about a young man. When the Roman armies, or the armies, the soldiers, and Judas come, and then Judas gives Jesus a kiss. There's a story about one of the Roman soldiers grabbing a young man who had nothing but a linen robe on. And like a cartoon character, this young man wiggles out of that robe and runs away into the night naked. Comic relief, maybe. Maybe this identifies the author. Some people think that this young man is the author. Some think this is just another different young man. Well, we don't know. It's a fascinating story, and the only points of continuity between this young man and Mark is that they were both young at this time. Now, the first readers and the first listeners to the Gospel of Mark, and let's remember that most of the people who were early Christians were listeners because they did not have possession of a written Bible, and most of them couldn't have read a written Bible if they had one. Literacy, mass literacy, is something that's only been, prevalent in the last 200 years or so. The early Christians, first century, second century, probably had direct word about who wrote this writing. The New Testament mentions an individual by the name of Mark 8 times. 8 times in different books, different places, and there is no guarantee that these all refer to the same Mark. They may well, and they may not. Mark was a rather common name in the Roman Empire, and it could be more than one Mark represented here. Some scholars think all of these passages refer to the same individual. Others argue that, well, we can't be quite so sure about that. Well, let's look at some of these passages. In Colossians, Mark is identified as the cousin of Barnabas. In our traditions, we generally don't put much emphasis on the importance of Barnabas, but in the early church for years, Barnabas was a whole lot more important than Paul. Barnabas is not his real name even, its real name is Joseph, but he was such a vital person in the early church, they nicknamed him Son of Encouragement because he was so encouraging to the Christian community. He lived a life of example for others. We see this when Barnabas puts his life at risk to introduce Paul and get him acquainted with the Jewish church in Jerusalem. Barnabas, cousin of Mark, very significant figure in the early church. Mark comes into view in Acts chapter 12. He's a companion of Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary tour, as we call it. We generally call it Paul's first missionary tour, and we kind of slight Barnabas in this, but Paul and Barnabas and Paul were being sent out by the church in Antioch on a missionary tour, and Mark goes along. You might remember that partway through the journey, for reasons that are never cited in the text, Mark leaves the group and goes back home. Well, so Mark is associated now with Paul as well as his cousin Barnabas. Also in Acts, we read that John Mark, which we may or may not think is the same as the Mark we've been talking about, that John Mark is the son of Mary. This was the Mary, and there's lots of Marys in the New Testament, but this is one who's, I think, only mentioned basically here, the son of Mary, and whose home the Jerusalem church met. So John Mark had connections, personal connections, because the early church leaders and the early church followers, the early church in Jerusalem met in his house. Wonderful opportunity to make contacts, wonderful opportunity to learn about Jesus. In 1 Timothy, Paul directs Timothy to bring Mark with him to wherever Paul is at this point. So Timothy and Paul are connected here. And Philemon, Mark is listed as a fellow worker with Paul. And so these two references indicate that if this is the same Mark who went on the first missionary tour, he's working very closely now with Paul. And in perhaps the most significant of the passages, in 1 Peter, Mark is said to be the son of Peter. Mark, my son. Now, it could well have been Peter's biological son he's referring to. We know Peter was married because Jesus heals his mother-in-law. So if he had a mother-in-law, he had a wife. If he had a wife, he might have children. And that might be a biological child. We don't know. We tend to interpret that figuratively as Mark is his sort of protege. Some argue that from this passage and from other writings that Mark is the interpreter of Peter. But that passage is the only one that really ties Mark in with Peter. But this will become the tradition of the church. In fact, when we have our first discussion that I'm familiar with about the history of authorship on the Gospel of Mark, it's this passage and this understanding that Mark and Peter are closely tied together that dominates the tradition of the church from the 2nd century on. Well, I think it's a fair conclusion to make that Mark was a person of some importance in the early church. While there may have been several of them, we tend to think that the Mark who wrote this book had connections with several disciples and early church leaders. You know, he learned Greek, probably not raised as a Greek speaker. But he does present us with a gospel that Matthew and Luke found very useful in the construction of their gospels. Everything that happens in time and place. Let's investigate the time and the place for which Mark was written. Mark, as we investigate the time in which it was written, Mark has no copyright date. There were no copyrights in the ancient world, and we have nothing other than traditions from the late 2nd century that present a timeline for the Gospel of Mark. We can use carbon-14 dating on some of the manuscripts, some of the early manuscripts of Mark, but that poses two problems. One, carbon-14 dating always destroys a little bit of the material itself. To subject a manuscript to carbon-14 dating would mean that there'd be less manuscript down the road. So that's a problem. The second and more important problem, I think, or issue, is that if we do submit a manuscript to carbon-14 dating, all we get is the dating of that manuscript. We don't get the original dating because, so far as we know, we have no original manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark or any other New Testament writing. So if we got a carbon-14 dating that said this manuscript was written between 175 and 200, well, that manuscript may well have been written in that 25-year period. But it was copied from a copy, or a copy, or a copy, or a copy. We don't know how many copies removed it is from the original manuscript. Manuscripts in this time were difficult to produce. They took a lot of time, and you had to pay someone, usually, to copy these. So, very, very difficult. The way we try to date the New Testament writings in general is to see what the context from the writing seems to be. Are the writings addressing a particular issue at a particular place, time? What seems to be the direction that the writing is going on, and then we try to connect it with a place. As many scholars come over and examine the Gospel of Mark, we find that the emphasis is on suffering, the crucifixion, and the end of the world as we know it. Therefore, as we look for the context that Mark is addressing, we look for places where Christians experience suffering, even suffering to the point of death, crucifixion in some cases, and the end of the world. As we look at what we know from the early times of the church, we can look in the book of Acts and see a number of persecutions of Christians, particularly in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, it points out that after the martyrdom of Stephen, the church was persecuted and Christians spread out around the world. Particularly important is Antioch. So there are a number of times and places where the early Christians were persecuted. But when it comes to the dating of Mark, scholars point to the mid-centuries, particularly in the 60s, as a time of acute persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. In the year 62, the chief priest in the temple in Jerusalem brings about the martyrdom of James. This is James, the brother of Jesus, also called James the Just or James the Righteous, because he was so well respected among Jews, not just Christians, but Jews, for his religious convictions. But after the martyrdom of James, the high priest takes an interlude where there is no functioning governor in Judea to initiate a persecution of Christians in Jerusalem and elsewhere. Some individuals, some scholars think this is the time and the place where the Gospel of Mark was written. More popular among scholars is the period of Nero's persecution of the Jews, of Christians, between 64 and 66. You might remember the story from the Roman historian Tacitus that Nero wanted urban renewal and attempted to burn down the tenement buildings. Some of these tenement buildings in Rome were 6 floors high, made of wood and very flammable. And much of Rome burned as a result of this fire, whether or not Nero started it or not. But after the fire, people were blaming the government, and so Nero, tried to save his own hide by blaming it on Christians. And since Christians wanted to be the light of the world, he soaked a whole bunch of them in tar, tied them up to a post, and lit up the Appian Way for a while, as well as his own pleasure garden with these burning Christians. But this is not only a period in which everyday Christians were persecuted. This is the time in which traditions that date back to the late first century associate Peter and Paul with the church at Rome. According to the traditions of the church, Peter fled persecution and is confronted by God on the way out of Rome. Whither goest thou? Where are you going? Why are you hightailing it out of here? And so Peter goes back and he's martyred. They're going to crucify him. And he says, I'm not worthy to be crucified like Jesus. Crucify me upside down. And so you have the crucifixion of Peter. The events in Paul's life are more clouded, and we're not sure exactly Paul's last years. Acts lays him in prison in Rome. The tradition picks up there, but there are also traditions that Paul was released from that first Roman captivity, and he preaches in Spain and other places, and there are churches that trace their ancestry in Spain to the preaching of Paul. But somehow he's back in Rome, and it's an unhealthy place for Christians, and he is martyred there as well. According to the traditions, he was a Roman citizen, so he did not have to suffer the indignity of the cross, but he was beheaded by a sword. In the Christian traditions, the body of Peter is buried under St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, in the Vatican, and the body of Paul was buried in the church called St. Paul's outside the wall, because when it was built, it was outside the Roman city wall. Those are the traditions of the church regarding these two men and the persecutions of Christians in Rome. A third time in the 60s that persecutions of Christians were substantial begins in the year 66 with the first Jewish revolt. The first Jewish revolt is a revolt by Jews in Palestine or Judea against Roman authority, against Roman rule. And I don't have to tell you, it's a revolt. It didn't go well for the Jews. But as the revolt is beginning, Christians say, no, we're not going to participate in this. And so most of the Christians did not participate in the first Jewish revolt, although the vast majority of Jews in this area of the world, a vast majority of Christians in this period, in this place, were of Jewish background. They did not join the group. There may have been a couple of individual Christians who did, but as a group, they did not. And as such, they were treated much like loyalists in America were treated during and after the American Revolution. They were harassed, they were persecuted, and some were martyred during this period. So this is the third period. Most interpreters, but not all, argue for Nero's persecution of the church in Rome between 64 and 66. There are a lot of different reasons for this. Some of them, the time period, some of them, evidence we'll get to later. So the work itself comes out of the conditions of the 60s and perhaps early 70s. Location. In real estate, the three keys: location, location, location. Well, in trying to understand the context of a writing, location is very important. You can have people saying that very exact thing in two different places and mean different things by it. If you see someone out in a lake drowning and yelling, "Help," that person will be saying the same thing perhaps as somebody on the third or fourth story of a building on fire sticks his head or her head out the window and yells, "Help." The words are the same, but they are expecting different things. The guy in the fire might appreciate someone's shooting a water hose up there and bringing some relief to him and his situation until help can arrive. The person drowning in the lake doesn't want you to, soak him down with more water. He's got all the water he can handle. Context. Just like there's no copyright date, there's no location cited, there's no publisher cited, there's no place of publication cited. And so we have to look at the text itself and see what we can determine about the context of this writing. One of the first places we look is to the linguistic evidence. The writing itself is written in Greek, so the audience knew Greek. Some of them just knew it through conversational Greek, we'd call it. Others could read and write in it. But the audience, by and large, knew at least some elementary Greek. Many of the Old Testament quotations, moreover, are found in the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures called the Septuagint. The Septuagint translated the what we would call the Old Testament passages from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek. There are a number of loan words in the text. Loan words are words we get from other languages that we use regularly, and no one knows when they come into the language, or in many cases we don't know the literal meaning of them. But we use loan words in English. If someone has carte blanche, they have, unequal privilege. Although the term itself comes from the French and literally means white card, it means more than just the color of a card one has. It refers to privilege. And there are a number of loan words. in the text. Some of these loan words come from Latin, and these loan words are not explained. So the audience can be assumed to know what these loan words mean. On the other hand, there are a number of Aramaic words that are used in the text, and these Aramaic words are translated into Greek. These words are explained. For instance, on the cross, Jesus utters the words of dereliction. They're cited in the Aramaic, and then Mark gives us a translation. My God, why have you forsaken me? Those in the original are in Greek. So you have to explain Aramaic words to the audience. So it's an audience that may well know Latin, but not Aramaic, and whose primary functioning language is Greek. In our society, in our times, we don't pay much attention to what was spoken in the early churches, and we would probably jump to the natural conclusion that the church in Rome spoke Latin like the communities around them and so forth. But we would be wrong. The primary language of the Roman church for over 150 years or so was Greek. If you look at Paul's letter to the church at Rome, he wrote it in Greek. The major writings that come out of the Roman church, like 1st and 2nd Clement, which are not biblical books, although they had people who wanted to put them in the New Testament, but these are in Greek. So the church in Rome spoke Greek for 150 years or so. So linguistically, we look at a people who speak Greek, who knew some Latin, who didn't seem to know Aramaic. The cultural evidence. In Mark 7, Mark takes opportunity to explain Jewish customs. Now, if the audience was primarily Jewish, he probably wouldn't have to do that. They probably knew their customs and traditions. But Gentile believers would need some help in understanding Jewish customs. On the other hand, in Mark 10, women are able to initiate divorce. Women could divorce their husbands. That was not possible in the Judaism of Jesus' day, and in Orthodox Judaism today, it's still not permissible, so far as I know. But this refers to a non-Jewish custom, and so the context in which the Christians that Paul was writing to appears to be a Gentile community. The traditions of the church, the history of the church, point to Rome. 1 Peter 5:13 connects Mark with Peter, and Peter's associated at the end of his life with Rome, and so you have that connection. There's an interesting connection through Rufus. Rufus is not a well-known figure in the early church. He's first mentioned in Mark chapter 15:21. He is identified as the son of Simon of Cyrene. Mark tells us that Simon of Cyrene carried Jesus' cross. And Matthew and Luke both pick up on that and include Simon's name. But Mark goes on and adds that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Rufus is not a widely known name in Roman society, but Paul will mention the name Rufus in his letter to the church at Rome, Romans 16, verse 13. And so there is a Rufus in Rome. There's a Rufus that's mentioned only in the Gospel of Mark. And many individuals see these two as the same individual. And so it points to a connection with Rome that Mark knew about and he incorporates into the text. Because if he's writing to the church at Rome, then he is connecting them with this historical figure that was important in their day and in their church. After all, if you were in the church in Rome and Peter and Paul had been martyred, and you have Rufus, whose father carried the cross of Jesus, Rufus would be an important person by implication here in the Church of Rome. Then in the 2nd century, we have the testimony of an individual by the name of Papias. The writings of Papias have not been maintained, have not been kept. They've been lost to us as historians as a whole, but we have several excerpts from Papias in the writings of the 4th century Christian historian Eusebius. And Eusebius points out that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark, who took information he got from Peter and reorganized it as he saw fit and gave it to the church at Rome. So the evidence seems to point pretty definitively, I think, to writing to the church at Rome in the late 60s or perhaps a year or two or three into the 70s as the time and place of writing. One interesting fact about the author that we get from Eusebius via Papias is that he was called Mark the Stump-Fingered. And some argue that that meant he had small hands, others that he had lost fingers. We don't know exactly what that might mean, but that's the one sort of incident or aspect of Mark that we actually have some information about.